Welcome to Philosophy from the Frontline. This podcast explores the intersection of philosophy, entrepreneurship, and veteran transition. Join us as we delve into the minds of successful entrepreneurs who have made the journey from military service into small business ownership. Our guests will share their insights, experience, and unique perspectives on life, business, and the world around us. Through deep conversations and thought-provoking discussions, we hope to inspire and empower our listeners to tackle their own challenges and achieve their dreams. So sit back, relax, and get ready to explore the world of entrepreneurship from a veteran's point of view. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Welcome back. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, episode number 98. So I have Jake Dyal here, and he's going to talk about his transition. And he's got an interesting story. And so, looking at your background, you've done quite a few things. You start off as a service member in the uniform, transition into some other things, and then you've transitioned into something else. And so, because this podcast is all about transition, let's talk about those. But let's get the simple stuff out of the way first. So, tell me about you, where you're from, what inspired you to join the military, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So my name's Jake Dyal. I'm from Tampa, Florida, and somehow I actually ended back up in Tampa, Florida. But when it was 1998 and I was looking at my prospects here in Tampa, there weren't many. I could be a banker or a lawyer, and I didn't want to be either. I wanted to spend time outside. I wanted to do stuff with my hands. I wanted to get out there doing stuff in the world. So I did college for a little while, but it wasn't as interesting. So I wanted to join the military, and I did. I was fortunate enough to serve 13 years. Was in a variety of different units. I see the airborne template in your background. I too was airborne, ducked out of long time station at Bragg. So I was somewhat different in that regard on the airborne side. But yeah, and transitioned out of the military into a contractor role. And then I was a government civilian for 10 years. And then, like you said, started business with me and my co-founders doing a software company.
Yeah. And so, the military background is always important. And this is what this podcast is about, is transitioning. So when you leave the uniform, you have to make a deliberate process. And a lot of people's, and I say this every time, transition is unique to you as your DNA is. So like when you got to that point, when you decided like, hey, I'm going to leave the uniform and, go into government contracting. What was that experience like? Because typically, some people have like, oh crap, I got to get a job because, I got to keep the lights on and feed the family. Or it's just like, hey, this is something new and interesting, and I just wanted to explore it. Where did you fall in that like spectrum of transitioning out of the uniform?
Yeah, so it was an odd scenario. I had actually PCS'd back to Tampa. So that's where my family was and family was from. And I had opportunity outside of the military. So like that was looking good and it was interesting. And a lot of the mission stuff that I was doing, at that point in my career, some of the admin stuff that was associated with the military was kind of getting in the way. Like I was just more excited about doing the mission. I was more excited about contributing on that kind of technical sphere that I was at. So I had an opportunity, and also too, the military is big on picking up and moving around, and you're leaving where you're at every 3 years, every 2 years sometimes. If you're lucky, you get stationed in one place for a long time. So I was wrestling with that because I'd done a lot of PCSs. So I decided it was probably better if I left the military at that time. I had a lot of years in to not go after retirement, but I knew that I could transition that into a government civilian role eventually, or maybe get back some of that retirement. So it wasn't as heavy on my mind. So that's kind of where I was mentally. Was just trying to find that next thing. I had this opportunity and really wanting to stay in this lane of where I was in the mission.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the hard parts that everybody has to encounter throughout the course of their career. Do I do 5? Do I do 10? Or do I go for the long haul and try and hit 20? I used to say I'm only going to do 30 minutes past 20. I'm walking across the stage. I ended up doing 23 years. Go figure how that works.
Yeah.
But, depending upon, the work that you are doing, yes, absolutely. Bureaucracy gets in the way. Sometimes, we don't use the law of parsimony at all in the military. Like if the simplest solution is there, we're going to go all the way around it and take the circuitous route to get to the end state, because there's so many hands and so many different people that are involved in the outcome. And I think that's probably personally why I started gravitating towards technology, because technology is there's an answer, right?
Right.
Like if I can put enough time, energy, and effort into it, I can get there.
It's a
And I
0
think,
or a 1.
yeah, it's very, very, is it going to work or is it not going to work? And I think that's a huge part of understanding, how I got excited about, finding technology. And, you know, as a government contractor, I'm sure that the experience was different because you're not in the uniform. But did you find like the same level of bureaucracy, or worse, or better? Did it get smoother as you transitioned into that opportunity, or no?
Yeah, it was just different. I was still dealing with the government, but I was also dealing with the company I was working for. And, they had a different hierarchy and different structure. Actually, at the time, my boss and then an advisor who were kind of dealing with me most directly, they were kind of half retired, like in their mid to late 60s. So I'd be showing up at like 8 o'clock, ready to go. They wouldn't be around till 10. So I'd be there like doing my stuff, trying to find all these different things to do and, trying to push the needle forward. And they weren't really in that same mindset. So it was kind of an odd transition for me because I was used to just go, 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 try to produce, put it all out there. Not everybody was in that same mindset. So I had to make sure that I was producing value for that company and then setting up that next thing. And I was fortunate enough to kind of set up the next thing through the work. I was working for a company. We did a congressional, working on an appropriation. And during that time, I was able to land a government job in the organization where the money was going to. So I was dealing with that customer at the time, and
Mhm.
they liked me well enough. They saw that I could produce, so I was able to kind of move over there. But the values that I had towards work and output, you know, it was different than other people around me, and that's when I first started to realize, like, okay, this military service thing that I did was really really valuable, but it does mean that I have a different way of approaching my day to day.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the I think that's part of the reason why so many veterans end up going into like government contracting or going into like the services type arena, because it's familiar enough to the uniform
Yeah,
where they can, hey, if I come in and I'm doing weapons training or drivers training or whatever training that I'm doing, or you know I can develop certain things that I've learned from the military and providing that service back to the military, because you know that there's a gap. One, because you left,
yeah,
but the other part of it is there's a change in expertise in the military over time, right? So the guys of our generation that started in the late 90s and went through the mid 2000s or into the 2020s, our philosophy on leadership, combat, and warfare is completely different from the guys now, because we had years and years and years of fighting the Russian horde, at JRTC and NTC, prior to it flipping over into transnational terrorism and some
yeah.
of the other things that we had. And so those points in our career like actually forced change on us, and so I think it made us a little bit more adaptable. But I also think that we have an entire generation of military leaders that are digital natives, so they grew up with iPhones, they grew up with all
Yep.
this capability in their pocket, and now they would rather rely on technology than utilize their eyes. And it's awesome. It's great because there's a mix of both, and I think that's the right answer is there's a middle ground. But you know as you transition out of this other your opportunity and end up in the federal stuff, it sounded like you ran into an organization where your work ethic and leadership style did not jive with the work ethic and leadership style of the guys that you work with. And that's another common trend that a lot of veterans see too, right? Like, hey, look, I'm going to join this company because it looks great on paper and I'm going to be the right fit. And were there any indicators up front that made you say, maybe these guys might not be it? Or is it just, hey, I'm working to seek that opportunity for employment, and then it kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, so there were indicators for sure, but I was willfully blind to them. I talked to the guy. I talked about work output and everything. I talked to the person who kind of set up the interview. He'd given me that opportunity, so I was really happy that someone found something for me. I was definitely very, very loyal to, that person. So I was just like, well, there's some potential weirdness here, but everything looks good on paper. And my buddy John says it's good. So it's good. So, after you get there and you're a little, looking around after a little while, you're like, maybe it's not so good. Maybe I should have, investigate a little bit more. Maybe John's motives weren't the same as mine. I don't know. It was encountering those scenarios was kind of eye opening for me.
Yeah.
That people would be setting up those opportunities for their own gain as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of it too. Is it's like sometimes you genuinely meet some disingenuous folks, right? Like there's some
Yeah.
people that are just out there for their own thing and they're just not good people. Or, you have the unintended folly of, the guy that's really passionate about a technology or a thing or something that they're working on a project.
Yeah.
And that's the person that's your interface, right? So the person
Right.
that's your interface can be like, hey, Jake, you got to come do this, man. Like you'll be perfect for this team. Let's do it. And you ignore the red flags because of the relationship that you have with the person that bought you in.
Correct. Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, my buddy was super passionate, just like you said. I was interacting with the leader who was there. He had been in places that I had been, so he knew kind of what I was about. So he knew how to manage it. It was really that leadership element above. They had different priorities, and you have to recognize that. It's like, what are you walking yourself into? You're walking yourself into a business. The business goal is to make money. So like if you're not adding towards the bottom line, they're going to be like, well, what is this all about? So you have to make sure that your efforts are kind of aligned with their goals, and the goals of these people who are passionate setting this thing up.
Yeah, for sure. And that's an experience that I've had that like I will not dive into because we could have certainly have that conversation offline.
Yeah, yeah,
But one of the things that I've also noticed is it's that transition, right? So like you have to understand that in the military there's a hierarchical structure for a reason. There's rank,
right,
there's positions, there's positions that are, I won't say awarded to people, but people are placed in those positions based off of their level of experience and their time in service, right? So,
yeah,
like, hey, if you're looking at the battalion commander or the XO, there's an expectation that those guys have done certain things to get them to that point.
right, right.
That's not always true in business, right? Sometimes it's like, hey, this guy
No,
was the dude that could convince the investor to cut the check, and so that's why he's the president of the company,
correct.
and that's great, but it also doesn't mean that guy understands the day-to-day execution or operations that go on within that organization. And so there's a gap in competence, and it doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad person. It just means that like, hey, this guy was good at what he was good at when he was in the uniform. He happened to be the guy with the gift of gab or the skill set to introduce us to this organization. We've got the job now. How do we do it?
Yeah,
And sometimes, and I think we've all worked for bosses like that in the military and probably experienced some of that outside of the uniform as well, as like the guy that, briefs a good game, and he's smiling and he's talking, he's glad handing and shaking hands with people. But when it comes to execution, you're going, hey man, like, do you have any formal education in business, or are you just like running this thing off your gut? You
right.
know,
Yeah. Hey, think about all these transitions you make in the military, between the different ranks and the schools that you're supposed to go to, right? E40, E5 is what warrior leader course now. You're going to captain's course if you're getting, lieutenant captain. There's JPME. There's all these things that prepare you. There's these times where they spend months and they're saying, yeah, you're going to learn this skill in leadership. You're learning this skill in, tactics. You're going to have these little moments where you can fail in a controlled environment, and then we'll
yeah,
make you better. Business isn't like that, and so these people, like you're saying, they're just the ones that got the money. They're the ones that know the boss. They don't necessarily know about the execution. And then truly, maybe they're describing that execution in a way that's not what the customer actually wants. And then you have to deal with those kind of conflicts. So yeah, there's a lot of differences in the business world. for
Yeah,
sure.
and I think one of the other things that I've noticed too, like in the contemporary environment, particularly in like the tactical services arena for the military, is there's no longer GWAT. There's no
Yeah,
longer this big monolithic thing across the water that's providing support and that people are supporting. So now, as a business owner, what worked 5 years ago in that arena, now you have to adapt. And so this will lead perfectly into the technology discussion, right? Because
yeah,
now we're looking at how do we fight a war with fewer people and more technology? And
right.
how do I make the technology cheap enough to make it cheaper than a deployment, right? So, like we look at
Right.
Operation Spiderweb, which was massive. Like you take out a third of a country's, nuclear triad. You knock out the one of the legs of the nuclear triad with, cheap-ish drones.
Right.
But it took almost 2.5 to 3 years of innovation to get to that point,
Yeah.
right? So, like, how do you maximize, and this is a great question, so I'm going to ask you this because you're in the business of development and design. So
Yeah.
how would you create a thing, regardless of what it is, to make it cheaper, ubiquitous, and easy to use? Because I think that's the biggest use case. Is like I can be
Yeah.
very, very technical, but like to fly an F-35 I have to have a certain level of skill. To
Right.
fly a DJI Phantom I don't. you
Yeah.
know and so
Well,
there's
so like
Go
if you
ahead.
think about it's a mentality of like, and actually you brought it up just a moment ago. The GWAT era mentality is like we owned everything. We owned the sky. We owned the night. We owned any space. We owned it all. Like you could fly drones wherever you wanted to. ISR, air breathers. You want to get in a helicopter, go from A to B. Yes, you can do it. This new era, you have nothing. You don't own anything. It is all denied. So you have to think about, okay, how am I going to get things in this space? And the Ukrainians with Operation Spiderweb did a fantastic job because they knew how to get stuff in the space in a clandestine way. So they recruited a bunch of people. They had access to these 4 different military bases all throughout Russia. I think the furthest one away is like 4,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, right? And then they're like, okay, well, what can I get in this space? I can get everyday things. Like, okay, I can get containers. Containers are shipped everywhere. They're on trucks, and I think inside the containers they had like cabins or something that they were like built. They built this like cabin company and then shoved the drones in the tops of the cabins that just were opened up. Ingenious, but the only way it got into the environment was it was something that was already kind of supposed to be there, right? You had to think about what the environment really is and then what you're doing and how it fits well in that environment. And then it can be cheap and then it can be ubiquitous and then it can have great impact. But if you're like, hey, I just want to take a F-35 and like fly it in their airspace and bomb the crap out of something, that's just not going to happen nowadays. But that happened in the GWAT era. Like you could
Yeah.
just order an airstrike. You're like, hey, this is not great. Blah blah blah. There's this HVT. We have, SIGINT. We have this HUMINT. We have this guy leading us there. We're gonna go put eyes on target, and then we're gonna call an airstrike. Like
Yeah.
that doesn't happen nowadays.
Yeah.
Because this great power competition and these denied areas. So you got to think different.
Yeah. And I think thinking differently is how it gets done. And yes, there is, there's always something good for the tangible too. So I tell people all the time, after, my backstory, 20 years as a grunt, the 3 years as an electronic warfare guy, people would always ask me like, hey, what's the most effective way to neutralize a radar or a jammer? Kill the operator, right? Like if I can catch that
Yeah.
guy on his way to the coffee shop and snipe him, and he's like the most talented ELINT guy that they have, guess what? That capability is going to degrade. It's not going to go away, but it's going to degrade. And so I think it's understanding that, like, again, there's a mix of both.
Yeah.
And by being able to develop that mix of both, I think you'll be a lot more successful. And even when you think about, the combination of, and we can talk about the first person video drones because they're all over the news, right? But
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
look at the combination of what has happened is you took something like an FPV drone and I tied it to a fiber optic cable, which is innovation. And, oh, I can fly this thing further, faster, and more accurate than I can on RF, and it's unjammable. right?
Right.
And
Right.
so that's the secret sauce. Like, hey, look, I have to be able to fight in this denied environment. So how do I create a solution that allows me to do that? And again, it's pretty low tech, right? I used to say that all the time. Hey, what's the best way to prevent us from, having our comms jam, run wire? But how many people have seen a DR8 spool of, commo wire ever?
Yeah.
Like there's people in
Yeah.
the army that's never seen that.
Yeah.
And the guys that understand how to, lay wire and have a hot loop and all that other stuff are generals now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's what they were doing when they were, young platoon
Cable
leaders.
dogs are long gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if their cable now is Cat 5,
Yeah. Yeah.
or fiber optic. So
Yeah.
they're moving in a different direction. But I think there's something to be said about being able to balance, the new school and the old school. And I think what you're doing now, and here's your chance to kind of talk about your company and
Yeah.
everything that you're doing, is it sounds like you're trying to merge those two equities together.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because what I noticed. So my time in government as a federal civilian, I did 10 years doing that, and I was fortunate. I worked with OUSDINS, so Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. I was farmed out to solve a lot of data problems as a program manager. So I have a computer science background already. Knew how to code. Have a decent background in Python, R. All the nerds out there will make fun of me for the R, but don't worry, R is still good. So I was dealing with all of these customers out there on the defense side, and I noticed that there was this consistent pattern where people were not really thinking about their data, and they were just, hey, I want to solve this problem, and they were used to these push button solutions like, hey, I have a drone, I have eyes on target, I know where the HVT is, I've got SIGINT. They were used to these GWAT solutions, but this other era outside of the GWAT, this phase zero operations is what we called it at the time.
Yeah.
They required a little bit more thinking, a little bit more analysis, a little bit more, hey, what does right look like before going into the data? So what we do here at Certus Core is we have a software platforms powered by AI, and it helps you, like, you can type in a prompt or you can copy and paste your own writings on a problem, and it generates the structure of what your data product could be. You can modify that structure a little bit, decide like, okay, yeah, this is actually what right looks like if I get all of this different data. And then it helps you, once you get those different data points, create a data product and then interact with that data product. So you're able to integrate all these different heterogeneous data sources. You can take in, we're working on a project right now with FPV video, because even though they're doing these FPV drones, there's a lot of HUD information that's in
Yeah.
millions of different codecs. So we're
Yeah.
extracting that RF data. So EW spectrum. You can take text data, CSVs, really whatever you want. And as long as you've described it well, you can integrate that data and create this data product. And then more importantly, you can share it. We do everything with a governance standard, because that was one thing I noticed too, is like, I do all this work, deliver this product to this one government office. They had search, it was their own custom schema. Another office would want something similar, not the same,
Mhm.
using some of the data, not all of it. Well, you'd have to basically start over. Like,
Wow.
like it was sad, because you're like, well, I mapped all this stuff out to these different rows and columns, these search strings. It was all kind of custom to that delivery. So getting out of the custom realm, like, how do you build in this rule set so that you can interrelate these entities you've created for one data product to another data product? So we actually integrated something that's an ISO standard, comes out of philosophy.
Mhm.
It's actually bought in by the CDAO. Those of you who follow military and data stuff, Chief Data and AI Office bought into this standard. So allows you to share those data products you create. And now we're getting some traction with different government offices and a couple companies that are working for the government too. So
Yeah, that's impressive. And literally it's impressive because knowing I watched a $20 million deal a few years ago go the way of the dodo for authority to operate, right?
yeah,
So they had this massive contract that was built. And one day I asked a question. I was like, "Hey, do we have ATO on the Doden?" And like everybody's face just went ghostly white, and they're like, "Oh
yep,
crap," and the reason why is because like it's almost easier to design software for an individual customer, than it is to get on the government network. Like the development cycle is a lot shorter and less expensive. And,
Yeah.
software design and data management is expensive anyway, but doing it for the federal government is even more expensive. And
Yeah.
so hats off to you for being able to crack the code on that, because I know, the FedRAMP process and all the CMMCs and the ISOs and all the freaking, different certifications that are required to operate on the federal network is an arduous task, and it takes a while to get there. And the
Yeah.
fact that you are able to interact with government systems is huge, because, typically, like, you just can't touch it. And there's some brilliant products out there all across the board that people are creating that, again, placement and access is what's
Yeah.
required.
Yeah, you got to architect for the bureaucracy, so you got to
Yeah.
know what it is. We were fortunate; we already knew what the ATO process was. We knew how to get stuff on classified networks. And a lot of these companies coming up on the software side don't. Now, fortunately, too, the government and these other there's some other companies that are there to help you.
Yeah.
Big shout out to the guys at Second Front. They've been doing a lot of good work trying to make ATO more of a commodity. Where you can buy into a process as long as your software meets certain standards. You can buy into a process and at least get ATO on a certain couple of networks that they're on.
Yeah.
And I know Palantir FedRAMP's doing the same, and there's a couple other companies that are doing this. And then there's really great leaders out there like Danny Holtzman. He's the approving official out at CDAO. Who's just trying to break down the bureaucracy and telling everybody, hey, no is not the right answer. You got to get to yes somehow. So
Mhm.
there's been some growth in the cybersecurity landscape, but it's still hard.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's still a pain.
Yeah, well, fighting to the yes answer is one of the most difficult things that you can choose to do as a leader in any organization, right?
Yes.
Because no
Yeah.
is very easy, and one of the things is like I would prefer to say yes, but, rather than
Right.
no, right?
Yeah.
And the yes is like, yeah, we absolutely can get to this point, but it's going to cost you X number of dollars, this amount of time, this
Right.
amount of investment of whatever, and that's also, bringing it back to the military transition. That's kind of how you have to look at your transition too. Like, no, I will never take that job. Well, you can say no, or is it yes, but I have to have the following conditions in order for me to sign on with that company. I have to have
Right.
the following conditions for me to, decide to go into this organization and give it a shot. And I
Right.
think that's very important, because I mean, so many people just want to have, you know, I I ran into a guy that was like, "Oh, when I get out of the military, my base salary is going to be $250,000 a year." Like, wow, what company is that? Because I want to go interview for them too, because I might have a chance. But the reality of it is like, you're never going to get paid what you're worth, and the only way that you will is if you build your own company.
Yeah.
And that is a discussion that a lot of veterans, that's why veteranpreneurship is growing, because a lot of people are realizing it's like, yeah, I can build my own company and be profitable, and it doesn't have to be huge, or I can go work for one of the bigs, and the big companies, they're great because, like, especially in the federal contracting arena, because they're always looking for people,
Right.
but you may be the right fit for a short period of time. And I know that's one of the things that I'm working on right now in my personal life is I'm actually working on a degree, and part of the research that I'm doing is making sure that we can find the right fit for the organization, right? And we got to catch it early. So when we catch people early in that process, it allows us to identify their strengths and weaknesses and make sure those strengths and weaknesses are complementary to the organization that they're joining. Because we don't
Yeah.
do that, what ends up happening is, man, this guy sucks. Like, I can't believe we hired this person. Or that guy quits 8 months, 12 months in, because they're not compatible with the organization. But if we find that out up front, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to do that.
Well, so I believe a lot in that, like, because we've, hired people obviously at our company, and I actually do, I set up this process where we screen for values first, and they're the values of the organization, and and we had to really think hard about what it is we value from a person who's going to show up and contribute and do work, and those values are independent of their individual specialty area, so that value screening is up front. before we get to the, okay, let's nuts and bolts skills, show me what you got, assessment by a manager. So I believe heavily in that. So I'm glad that you're doing more research in that. It's
Yeah.
definitely, a lot of companies need it.
Yeah, and it's very valuable, right? Because again, that then once you figure out what the template is or the questions to ask, you can
Yeah.
apply that to different areas. Like, hey, I'm looking for military veterans, or I'm looking for, you know, I'm trying to find the right demographic, whatever that demographic is, software designer, et cetera, whatever.
Yeah.
And I can specifically target those folks and ask them the right questions to build the best team possible. Because again, that's like one of the advantages that the military has, and you don't see it inherently in everything that they do, is the military has a plan to build the best team possible. Like we function with the top 70th percentile of the people that make it into the military, right? And
Right.
so that's one of the advantages. How do I capture, that that same level of detail or structure when it gets into, my personal organization or my business, right? And so those are some of the things that I'm trying to answer, and I think it would be helpful to a lot of people because you can always extrapolate and do more research or more data. But man, we're at 30 minutes. This went really, really quick. This has been a great conversation. I do have a question for you though. Like,
Yeah.
as you were transitioning, what was a valuable lesson, maybe like a book or a speaker or somebody that, something that somebody gave you as a tool that helped you transition? Because again, like mine was a buddy of mine saying, hey man, you need to talk to this lady. She no longer is in business, unfortunately. She started a 501c to help veterans in the North Carolina area transition. And so
Yeah.
she still has some flavor of that, but it's not, the hardcore, hey, you're going to have a class over the next week with just 15 people, and we're going to teach you how to write a resume, and we're going to teach you how to do an elevator pitch and all that stuff. But what was one resource that somebody gave you that made your transition go smoothly?
Well, so it's actually it's not what you would think. Like there's a lot of stuff like you were saying that you can look up and you get a lot of good opinions, and you can even hire people to help you with resumes, stuff like that, or friends can help you out, get you interviews. For me, it was like I was leaving behind this sense of camaraderie, this sense of like shared struggle, and I found an outlet for that, and I've been doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu now for like, 12 years. Uh, and that really helped in that transition. Showing up, doing Jiu Jitsu, interacting with the same group of people. There's people who check up on you. There's this shared struggle. You're going through class and you're learning these new things. And that mental break helped me transition better,
Hmm.
because I knew that there were some aspects of what I was getting through that class that was reminiscent of the military. But then there was also there's the stress of it, right? You're always constantly thinking about it. You're like, oh man, I got to get this right. Especially me, I had a family, you still have family. I gotta feed everyone. I gotta do this thing right. I can't mess it up. You need to have something in there that's gonna take your mind off everything. And for me, maybe I'm lazy, but I can't get my mind off something unless somebody's trying to choke me or punch me in the face. So
Yeah.
like, it's hard to switch it off. So when someone's trying to put you unconscious, you forget about your problems for a little bit. So
Wow.
it's a very useful tool.
Yeah, I think that's the first time I've heard somebody recommend Brazilian Jiu Jitsu as a transition tool. However, I think that that's a very good point because, again, I've been doing jits for quite some time now,
Yeah.
and it's certainly a community of people that you can rely on, right?
Right.
And the best part of it is like you don't have to know anyone. You can show up to a jiu-jitsu gym anywhere in the country,
Anywhere.
and people are going to look at you and be like, "Oh, okay, you're here to train," right?
Exactly.
And it's very, very helpful because it's one of the most welcoming communities out there, and I think it's a benefit. It's a benefit to everybody. It makes you healthy, makes you mentally sharp, it gives you
Yep.
something practical to do, and you can use it in your real life if you had to, right? So
Right.
there's a whole bunch of things that are very, very tangible. And you know, I didn't even think of it until you mentioned it, but that's a very good point. It's the same level of like stress inoculation that you would get while you were in uniform, right?
Right.
So it's like going to the range, or like it's going to,
Right.
you know, like PT test, like, oh man, I got to do this PT test. This is going to suck. It's
Yeah.
that same level of like that anticipation, but also the physical overcoming of whatever it is that you're challenged with. And so I think that's a really good point. And you know, It's everywhere. Like one of my really good friends, like lifelong friends, is former military guy that I met. He was a cop in Tacoma 20
Right.
something years ago doing jujitsu, and we still talk to this day, you
Right.
know. And
Right.
so
And
you
those kind
could,
of relationships and bonds, they're formed on the mat, and it is very reminiscent of military service. So there's a lot of corollary. That's why a lot of veterans love jujitsu. Let's be honest, there's a lot of large veteran community in jujitsu as well. But for me, it was the mental part. It
mhm,
was like, yeah, yes, I'm getting that same shared struggle. I get that break. I get the, like you're saying, the stress. I got to solve a problem. Oh, I accomplished something. I hit this technique that I've been
yeah,
working on for weeks. Hit it in a live role. All of these things, they add to the mental value of it, and a lot of the normal skills like you're talking about within your transition. There's plenty of great books. There's plenty of great mentors. There's plenty of great podcasts like yourself, like this one, where you can reach out and like learn stuff tangibly about, okay, this is what this business world is, or this is how to do my resume, this is how to do an interview properly.
yeah,
But for me, I had to figure out how to control myself, and then that was an
yeah.
avenue to help control myself.
Well, and again, that's another great point. And to dovetail it into military transition, right? It's position before submission, right?
Right.
I need to make sure that my position is good before I go after something that could be a little bit risky, right?
Yeah.
So again,
Yeah.
as you're leaving the military, like I got to make sure that my position is correct. So that means I got to make sure that I had all my documentation done. I've got to make sure that all my medical's done. I'm registered with the VA. I've got all my appointments. I'm doing all
Yep.
those things because when I go for that, that go plata, I'm giving up my guard to trap this person in that may be successful. But if it's not, I still have all these other things that have been put in place as a foundation to prevent me from completely getting, blown out in the competition. So
100%.
I, that's really good. Super insightful, Jake. I really appreciate that because like I never, you know, always knew like inherently jujitsu is kind of like that, but like you
Yeah.
don't think of it in a sense of like mental preparation for transition. But
Yeah.
great, great point. Like, hey, I wish you the best. Like we're closing in on 40 minutes. I try and keep these between like the average commute of a human being to and from
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
office.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why we do about 40 minutes. But I really appreciate your time today. This has been a great conversation for me. It's always refreshing. It's always nice to like make a new friend, right? Because this is definitely a cold hit. Power of LinkedIn, folks, and I'll close with that. LinkedIn is a great tool. You know, put out what you want people to know about you on LinkedIn, but the other piece of it is it's the power of three. And so I tell people it's like if you're a staff guy in the army or you're using LinkedIn, just remember any connection that you have is going to connect to at least 2 to 3 other people. And so be cautious of what you put out unless your intention is it for it to hit 27 desks, right? Because if I send an email to 3 people, it's going to go to 9 people because they're going to send it to somebody above them, somebody below them, and those people are going to do the same thing. So you got powers of 3 and all of that. But certainly appreciate your time today. And yeah, this is awesome, man. Like, is there anything that you want to plug before you get off the show?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when starting a business, I didn't know anything about accounting. I didn't know anything about public relations. PR meant personal recovery to me. So uh, you know, if you're thinking about starting a business, reach out to your local entrepreneurship areas. I'm at the Embark Collective in Tampa. They've been a fantastic resource. Coaching is amazing. And really insightful because there's lot of things about business if you're thinking about starting a business that you just don't know. So reach out to those resources that do and try to align yourself with that community.
Awesome. That was awesome. Jake, really appreciate your time again today. And this has been Jake Dial and Rob Robinson from Philosophy from the Frontline. Hey, we'll see you guys on the high ground. Thanks. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Philosophy from the Frontline. We hope today's conversation gave you valuable insights into the journey of veterans transitioning into the world of small business. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. It helps more people find us and supports our mission to empower veteran entrepreneurs. Stay connected with us on social media and visit our website for more resources, tips, and episodes. Remember, your service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Your next mission is just beginning. Until next time, keep pushing forward, stay resilient, and turn your battle-tested skills into business success. This has been Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks.